Hello, everyone. This is Matthew Bunch talking to you from this day in Miami history, and I'm quite honored to be joined by David Brauer. Brauer, it doesn't take me much to get excited about the Miami Hurricanes, as you guys know, considering I attended the university. But Brauer wrote a book, The Wizard of College Baseball, How Ron Fraser Elevated Miami and an Entire Sport to National Prominence. And we're dropping this episode here on June 12th, the anniversary of Ron Fraser's and the Miami Hurricanes' first national championship in NCAA baseball, and one of the most important figures in South Florida sports history, far beyond the championships. That's almost a secondary feature, which is wild to say. But anyway, enough of me talking. David Brower, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me, Matthew. Appreciate being on and talking about the book.
Of course, yeah. No, as I mentioned to you earlier, I saw this book was shared on social media and pre-ordered it as soon as I possibly could because there's not a book that's more made for me than this. But you are not necessarily the person that one would imagine diving into this book. You're not necessarily a Miami aficionado per se. What led you to this journey of ultimately writing this book about this really important figure in college baseball history?
Yeah, I mean, you're very right in that. And I guess I can be an honorary Hurricane with this, but no, I went to school at the University of Illinois. I grew up in the Midwest, in Illinois presently, and just always had a passion for college baseball. And some of that actually began watching Miami on TV in the 80s with ESPN with their coverage. I mean, they were always on, always in the College World Series. And I began attending the College World Series in 1992, already with that kind of fandom for the Hurricanes. And of course, that was Ron Fraser's last season. And one of the first games I attended was wearing my Miami shirt and hat, and the team's getting off the bus as I'm waiting to go into Rosenblatt Stadium as a teenager, and I just went up to Coach Fraser and said, "Good luck, Coach," and or something corny like that when you're a teenager. But he said, "Thanks," and wear that hat with pride, and so that was kind of a cool interaction. And unfortunately, they didn't win that year and send him out the way everybody would have liked in a storybook finish. But that was an exciting experience and something that kind of grew with me. And here at the University of Illinois, around that time, just before that time, Augie Garrido, one of the other legends of college baseball, was actually head coach here for 3 years in between stints at Cal State Fullerton. And so there was an excitement about college baseball here in the Midwest and the Big Ten, where ordinarily it wasn't. And so those factors, going to the College World Series starting in '92, and something now here this June, I'll be going to my 21st over those years, try to get to it as much as I can. Um, has that background of interest. So then in my career, I've worked in college athletics, in the public relations, sports information department side of things. And so obviously it takes a lot of writing. I consider that one of my strengths. And so always in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, yeah, I'd like to write a book. What is it about? I don't know, what is it? And so, just kind of ironically, it was the summer of 2017. My family and I were down in South Florida on a vacation, and we went over to Miami for a day. First time I'd ever been there. And one of the highlights I wanted to see, obviously we had to do the Everglades and see go on the Gator boat tour there. But one of the highlights I wanted to see was the University of Miami. I just wanted to see what it was. You hear all about it, see Mark Light Stadium. What's that look like? And their sports hall of fame was right next door, and I thought, you know what, I'm gonna go check this out, probably like 15-20 minutes, just walk in, see what they have about Ron Fraser and about Miami baseball. And the funny part is, end up spending probably an hour talking to the gentleman behind the desk. He was a past president. His name was Earl Rubley. And I was wearing a University of Illinois shirt, and he had some ties to Champaign-Urbana up here, and we started talking about that, and then started talking about Ron Fraser, and he's telling me some stories from his personal relationship with him. And came away from that thinking, was there ever a book about Ron Fraser? Because I knew a lot of the stories, obviously knew the history with college baseball and his influence. And so in our correspondence, nobody had ever written it. He said, I could help you get to some of the right people. I said, all right, let's give this a shot. So, kind of put an outline together and what it would look like. Did some research, fortunately through the archives there at the University of Miami, able to access a lot of things on Coach Fraser from afar. And one thing led to another, getting the right people, seeking out a publisher. Unfortunately, Nebraska Press took it on, and they've had a number of sports books, a couple college baseball related books. So it all kind of tied together that way. And I guess the irony, but still kind of befitting of the storyline, is here's somebody in Illinois writing a book about a legend at Miami, published by a publisher in Nebraska. So it all ties together, right? College baseball, starting in Miami, going all the places across the country, and kind of near the home of the College World Series there.
Yeah, there's a lot that you touched on there that I want to circle back to involving your process. Um, but I do want to take it aside for a moment and say if you are a Miami sports fan, not even University of Miami per se, but if you have any interest in sports in South Florida, it would behoove you to pencil in an afternoon to go visit the Sports Hall of Fame because it is very much the kind of place where either Earl or John Ruth will likely be at that desk, and the stories are just fantastic. It's great, and they'll really walk you through everything. I was gonna say wasted, but I have enjoyed many an afternoon. Just, oh yeah, let me pop in there for 10 minutes, see something, and then all of a sudden it's 3 hours later, and you've heard just 100 great stories. Um, but so you wind up diving into this, and I did want to talk about your process a little bit before getting into the actual content of the book. You said that the Sports Hall of Fame was really integral in helping you out. You really go back through the history of the program and talking about late 50s, early 60s stuff. In terms of getting those sources quoted and in the book, how much of that was relying on, let's say, archival research, and how much of that was actually person to person, firsthand interviews?
Yeah, those early days obviously were really focused on the archival side of it. But once you really got into his time at the University of Miami, there were players that played for him. I'd speak to someone. I'd talk to John Ruth, as you mentioned, or Ken Lee, that was a longtime SID there at Miami, and they'd point me to somebody, and then I'd start talking to that person. They're like, "Hey, have you talked to these two or three guys?" Okay, yeah, I'll get,
Hmm.
what's their contact info. It was just, the
Yeah,
domino effect. And Coach Fraser's daughters, Cynthia and Liz and Linda, were really helpful. I'm really excited about this project. So I had the support of really anybody I talked to, and that was one of the coolest aspects of this, was that when you talk to someone, you could just sense the absolute adoration that they had for Coach Frazier. And find that with a lot of former players talking about coaches and mentors in their lives. But you could just get that feeling even over the phone in a lot of these conversations. And I did over 100 interviews of former players, former colleagues, maybe at the University of Miami, coaches that coached against him, people that he crossed paths with across the sport of baseball. And every one of them was just super positive about Coach Frazier and about what he did, and trying to help me find the right people to talk to and give me any resource information they could help provide.
that's really great. Yeah, being familiar with the sports scene down here. Miami football obviously gets a lot of the attention, and it's had its own success through a similar period of time. Um, but the baseball program is what I describe to people. It is the cultiest thing we have going, where it's small, but it's dedicated, and it's a whole different world. And I say that in admiration. I mean that I guess describing something as a cult is not necessarily positive, but like it's a whole different vibe, and really Fraser is like the shaman, like where everyone really points to. He is this central point that really created something out of nothing, and you get into that a little bit in the book. I want to explore that a little bit. How much did Ron Fraser, in taking on this job, take on something that appeared to be impossible, which was one, make Miami a respectable baseball program, but two, and something you alluded to as well, really change the geography of college baseball in a way that we're still reckoning with today, and just completely change the way the sport is played and organized. Like how do you really explain that to someone that doesn't know anything about this person?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And it's one of those things, and the more I dug into his story, the more remarkable it really is because there's so many layers to it. Before I get into answering that, you got to look at the international baseball side. So much influence he had in there. You know, Rod Dato at USC that had the dynasty of the 70s. He really kind of started that, but Ron Fraser took it to another level. Um, just that touch point there. Miami football. Yes, he had an influence on Miami football before, as someone told me, before the U was the U, it was baseball.
Yeah.
And football kind of rode the coattails of that, which is unfathomable, but to say now. And, things like that where you say, well, baseball's success preceded football and may have laid some of that groundwork, or the SEC was nothing back in those days because they didn't even employ a full-time head baseball coach anywhere. Those thoughts are just so out of whack, with what you see today. Or even the coverage aspect of it. I mean, you can go find basically every Division I game on a streaming platform at the very least, and multiple games on over-the-air networks over a weekend now. And the College World Series is such a staple for everyone on the sporting calendar. And those things didn't exist before Ron Fraser. So going back to your thoughts there was that, when he came to Miami, there was the skeptics were, well, you're never going to get anywhere with this. Jimmy Fox was the head coach and he couldn't get anywhere. He's a Hall of Fame player from the Babe Ruth era.
Yeah.
And, so it was kind of a lost cause. And the statements were, well, you're never going to make anything out of Miami baseball. And he inherited nothing. There was nothing. The field was marginal at very best, probably more like a park district or a little league field or something. But and he didn't even have equipment because the previous coach had given it all away to the seniors. So you're literally starting from scratch. So he starts building that foundation. But as you said, the really fascinating part about his story is not only what he did there at Miami, which is truly remarkable and a great story in and of itself, but how he grew the sport. And you look at the SEC today, and it's light years ahead of where it was then. It's a step ahead of everyone else in college baseball right now. But why is that? The SEC didn't win their first national championship till 1990. And prior to that, Ron Polk, who made a brief stint as an assistant coach under Fraser at Miami for a couple of months before he took the Mississippi State job right before the season, he was the first full-time head coach in the SEC, and he built Mississippi State. Then Skip Bertman, obviously a legendary figure there in South Florida, assistant coach for Ron Fraser for a number of years, goes to LSU, takes a program that he described the ballpark as a dump and that the fans didn't know a baseball from a hockey puck. There was no interest in LSU baseball. And he built that from nothing there, kind of taking the blueprint that Fraser had at Miami. Now look at what LSU is today and what Mississippi State is today. It's
Yeah.
just it's remarkable. And so now you've taken that for granted. So, but each of those SEC programs, the ADs were saying, okay, well, how do we make money? LSU's doing this, Mississippi State's doing this. And now you look at where they are and the fan bases and the enthusiasm for the sport and the success, and it you could really kind of all trace it back to Coral Gables.
Yeah, it's really like, you talk about a coaching tree in sports, and Fraser's contribution to the sport go really even beyond that. It's pretty crazy. So something that I wanted to ask you about, and something that I've often wondered about, is the fact that Ron Fraser didn't attend the University of Miami as a player. In fact, he played at Florida State. And it's one of these awkward things that you
Right.
point out, that and Miami fans are pleased to point out that Florida State has actually never won the College World Series, though they have been about as close as you can be over and over and over again. Do you get a sense, and you allude to in the book, that there was a point where the job was open and it was bandied about, but then Miami essentially made him an offer of what he wanted, and he stuck around. But did you get a sense from anyone that he, besides that point in time, ever considered going back? I'm asking you this, and you might not have an answer for it, but I've always wondered it because it would seem to me to be appealing to go back to one's alma mater, and he's coaching the rival, and not just the rival, but the team that winds up usurping their position in the Southeast. it would seem like a natural fit, and he never really didn't seem like he really took it up when he could have.
Yeah, and that Florida State position, at that time, it was, I think he had some frustrations at Miami. Were they going to improve the facilities? Was he going to get lights? Was he going to have the money put in to make it what he wanted to be? Or does he look up the road at Tallahassee and say, hey, this is already pretty established. I went to school here. He probably put his name in the ring, or back in those days they probably just called him. I mean, all the searches were much less secretive than they are today.
Yeah,
But there was newspaper accounts that, oh, he's on the verge of taking this job, and the student population rallied around kind of a Keep Fraser campaign, and eventually the university acquiesced and help convince him to stay. But I think ultimately it was that he had already made a home there, and I think he wanted to see through what he had done. I think that was the most important part. But in terms of another college job, from the conversations I've had, the only time that he probably really considered ever leaving was when it was maybe a professional opportunity, something different, because he
yeah,
had done just about everything at the college level. The New York Yankees, George Steinbrenner had, made overtures to him, maybe bring him aboard to oversee their minor league systems, positions like that. The Chicago White Sox were involved at one point and pursuing him, and I think he was close, but I think ultimately his heart was at Miami. I think his family wanted to stay at Miami. um, the grass isn't always greener, and
yeah,
I think one of the people I interviewed put it best that if you go to work for George Steinbrenner, obviously he's going to be your boss 24/7, but you're the boss here. So
yeah.
he had a great situation there, and why leave it?
Yeah, for sure. The words that come to mind when working for Steinbrenner is "rent don't buy."
Yeah,
Um,
right.
so in taking this job, and I encourage everyone who's listening to pause listening right now and go and get this book either digitally or physically, or we'll be sure to share links for purchase on our social and in the description of the show. The Wizard of College Baseball: How Ron Fraser Elevated Miami and an Entire Sport to National Prominence. There's so many great stories about those early years that I really do encourage people to focus on. That I love. My favorite is probably the one involving the evaporated milk trick that he picked up to keep the balls fresh, and that is one that's been bandied about a bit. If you're familiar with the program, but it's hilarious. But those years between 74 and 82, 74 being the first College World Series appearance, and 1982, where Miami actually seals the deal and wins their first national title. I'm curious if Frazier felt, and you communicated this in the book, and the team felt that it seemed like there was clear, consistent progress in those early years. Well, even though it was hard, that the things that he was doing, booking the tournaments with the Northeastern teams or the Midwestern teams, and all the little games and tricks he would use to kind of get the competitive advantage. It was clawing the program forward step by step by step. Those 8 years between the first appearance and the national title, do you get a sense from anyone that there was a concern that there was a plateau, or was he very much like for the other coach of the similar time period, Howard Schnellenberger, where he was just like, this is going to happen, get on board or not, but this is going to happen.
I think he firmly believed that they were going to win a national championship. And if you look at the progression, it was kind of that literal step by step. It was getting into an NCAA tournament, and we have to step back for a second and look back at those years. And the NCAA tournament was based on districts. It was nothing like it is today. And so you're literally kind of pigeonholed into that part of the country, and the Southeast region was massive. I mean, it went Mississippi River to, if I recall correctly, over kind of by Virginia and down south to Florida. So you think, obviously, again, as we talk about, historical reference, I mean, it's not as today's SEC involved, but still, there's a number of really good teams down there. And so I think it was getting to the NCAA tournament, winning in the NCAA tournament, coming very, very close, and ironically losing to Ron Polk at Georgia Southern when he was there, um, missing out on an opportunity to go to Omaha, and then in 74 breaking through and getting to Omaha. And that first College World Series appearance, I think, was a huge milestone for the program and for his career because they got there. But not only did they get there, they beat USC, the perennial power. The college basketball fans, you think of UCLA and
Yeah.
John Wooden and that dynasty. USC was pretty much doing the same thing, and it was such a West Coast centric sport at the time. It was USC and Arizona State for the most part. There were a couple teams that maybe broke through and won a couple games in the College World Series, but they didn't win national championships as much. But it was USC dominating, Arizona State following closely with a couple national titles or finishing second to USC. And by beating USC, it was like, hey, we're the new kids on the block. We're from a different part of the country that, take notice. And I think the nation really did, and college baseball certainly did as a sport. They were so close to winning that national championship that year that probably fueled everything for subsequent years. And they had some tremendous teams in the late 70s and into the early 80s there. And it's kind of ironic that 1979 and 80, they had two of their best teams, winning percentage wise, victory wise, but fell short in Omaha. And in 81, they had Neil Heaton and Mike Pagliarulo. I mean, those are two guys that were, stars in MLB for a number of years. And it was 82 in a quote unquote retooling season that they broke through and won the national championship for a variety of factors. I think just, the team camaraderie, the style of play. They beat Roger Clemens and to get to the championship. And then, of course, the most memorable moment there is the Grand Illusion, Phantom Pickoff. Call that. It's got a number of nicknames to beat Wichita State, who was an absolute force at the time. And so I think all those things came together in '82, where maybe they had the talent, but maybe they just didn't have the luck, or they just didn't have something. And I know there were some conversations at the time where we got to change our style of play a little bit. Maybe we need a little more power. Maybe in Omaha, the game's played a little bit differently than it is in regular season. So, but he adapted and he got that national championship in '82. Finally broke through.
I find it interesting you alluded to it a second ago, but I would say both of Fraser's national championships at Miami were in years where you could go back and find other teams that on paper, not just on paper, because that implies like names, but like when you actually look at them playing on the field, you would have expected other teams to have done better. The 85 team is the happiest team in America. They were not expected to win flatly. And both these teams, like you said, there's something to be said about just it's almost to make it too simple, just about getting hot or getting, having breaks go your way. But it's unless you are demonstrably better than everyone else. And with the College World Series, you have these numbers of teams that are qualifying. It's not just winning one game, like a national championship game per se. You've got to get through the gauntlet and get through, the round robin portion of it. And it's hard. And one bad break or losing your first game, everyone knows losing your first game in Omaha is just, it takes the air out of you. And there's so much about just a team that can catch lightning in a bottle. And I would say both those teams are perfect examples of like, yep, they was just their time. And I think 82 really does encapsulate that.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. I mean, if you took a really detailed historian of Miami baseball and made a list of the top teams based on talent, whether it's how many major leaguers, what their record was, all the accomplishments they might have had in a season, national championship out of that question, those teams probably aren't even in the top 10 all time at Miami. And even in Fraser's era, they're probably maybe, let's say, there's fifth or sixth best teams. But that 85 team, as you mentioned, with 82 kind of being a surprise, 85, they came into Omaha in a time where when the eight teams got there, they reseeded them. And Miami was number 8 out of 8.
Yeah.
And that field was just absolutely loaded and perennial powers. Oklahoma State at the time with Pete Incaviglia, who had 48 home runs. Miami hit 58 that year as a
As a
team.
team.
Mississippi State, if you haven't seen Thunder and Lightning on,
Yeah.
the ESPN Plus, talking about that team, Rafael Palmeiro and Will Clark and Bobby Thigpen, that was the team that's supposed to win it,
Yeah.
that caliber of players. and they beat Stanford in the first game that year. I believe it was 17-3, and Stanford had five major leaguers. That College World Series as a whole, the other seven teams had about 3 dozen players that went to the major leagues. Miami had none. And my favorite little fact about that was the only two major leaguers they had was the mascot John Ruth and the PA announcer Jay Rokeach, because they both went to work for the Marlins later.
That's hilarious. That's really funny. Yeah, that is one of those, it can be hard in college athletics, in particular if it's not football, it can be hard to really inculcate in younger like students at the school those kind of important historical things. Again, football sucks the air out of everything. But that 85 team is like a miracle to me. And it was always like going back and like you said, that 85 Mississippi State team is just you look at again on paper, it's like this is one of the great college baseball teams of all time, full stop. And it's just they got the bug. And it's just the bug that strikes you when you get there sometimes that you just it's not your day and that's it.
Yeah, there were a
Um
lot of miracles in that season. Greg Elena, the bullpen catcher, that becomes the folk hero and
yeah.
carries in Omaha and wins most outstanding player. Ron Fraser in his lucky shoes that he wore in '82, trying to squeeze into those. All these things. It was a unique story, that '85 team.
Yeah. So coming back to late 70s, early 80s for a second, because again, you alluded to it a few moments ago, the idea of building a program, and that's more than just winning games, right? The idea is, especially from where Miami was coming from, which is basically a dirt patch at the corner of Santa Maria and Ponce. That was pretty much it, to actually having a full-fledged stadium for baseball and then putting more resources into the program. I, Frazier's ability to coach the game is exceptional, unquestionable. But even more than that, his ability as a promoter and not only for his program but for the sport, and the awareness that promoting for the sport was good for his program, I think is ultimately his greatest contribution to college baseball. If you could tell us a little bit, again, I don't want you to get into the best stuff, save it for the book so folks buy it, but if you can get folks a little bit of an idea of what his mind was for promotion and why that was so important.
I mean, we could spend a whole episode on just talking about some of these promotions because one, they're entertaining, and two, they're just downright funny in a lot of ways. I mean, there was something going on every night at a home game. It wasn't, hey, we'll book our Tuesday nights because there's going to be a small crowd against a D2 school or something. I mean, he had something going every night, and there was open heart surgery night where if you were the winner, quote unquote winner, you had a year to redeem that if you needed it. Or they would have car giveaways where it would be a junker off the lot that probably barely got into the ballpark and somebody drove away with it, but they were just as happy as could be. I think one of the best all-time promotions revolves around the Miami Maniac, the first mascot devoted to a college baseball team. Obviously, you have the Ibis. Every school pretty much has a mascot of some kind, but this was devoted to college baseball. And he got married one night on an ESPN Sunday night broadcast, which we can get into the broadcast side of it too, where Ron Fraser got college baseball on ESPN and made a tremendous leap in the growth of the game. But the Maniac was married on live television on ESPN, and who does this stuff? Who comes up with this stuff? And you're winning games on the field, and it was just it was kind of the three-ring circus type of thing, but all in a great way. And you talked about how his promotional aspect, but he could have taken all that and just said, you know what, I've got my program really clicking here. This is no doubt the program of the 80s, the top program of the 80s in every way, from on the field to exposure to everybody who wanted to play at Miami. And he could have taken that and just said, you know what, I don't want to share my secrets. He went out and helped so many coaches, so many programs, saying, you know what, if you do this, this is where to start. And one example is Jim Morris, who obviously came to Miami later, but when he was at Georgia Tech, kind of facing a similar situation, school in a major city, baseball's kind of an afterthought. He picked Coach Frazier's brain and said, okay, how do I do this? And he gave him the tools to do it, and so many other examples. And that's really one of the remarkable pieces of this story too, is not only the growth of the game from, as we mentioned earlier, the coaching tree, but helping people with, hey, if you promote this way, or you build the facilities, or how do you take your program to the next level? And there were so many, programs in different parts of the country that followed suit and enjoyed that success.
Yeah, it was really a rising tide lifts all boats. And the thing you alluded to before we wrap up, I do want to ask about is the broadcast component and the idea that at the same time that Frazier is really coming into his own and getting Miami where he wants it to, you have this cable revolution, and you have, the ESPN of today is a Leviathan, but the ESPN of the early 1980s needed programming. And college baseball and Ron Frazier was, again, more than arguably anyone else in the world, responsible for getting college baseball on television at a time when it was the third of college sports, finding that space. How important is that for not only Frazier and his program, but again for college baseball overall?
As someone put it, and I have it in the book, that was the biggest factor in the growth of college baseball. And it all started because of Frazier going to ESPN. And again, this was like their first year, just completing their first year in the very infancy of this network. And their programming consisted of, what are we talking here? Fitness shows and maybe Australian rules football and just, a bunch of really random things. And he went to Bristol and sat there in the ESPN studios and basically begged everyone, put college baseball on TV. I've got a great product here. This would fit your programming. And he didn't take no for an answer, gave out Miami hats and jackets and whatever else to help get them interested. And they came away and said, "Sure, we'll come. We'll do a USC Miami series." Mind you, again, as we talked about, USC being the perennial name, the household name, Miami being the upstart, really starting to get a name for themselves. The East West Classic is what they called it. They were going to do one or two of those games live. Coach Frazier talked them into all three. They did the entire weekend series live. The games were phenomenal. ESPN said, "This is great. We got tremendous feedback." Baseball in February, people up north want to see that. It's kind of gets you into that spring summer mindset. And they ended up having a kind of a game of the week, 8 to 10 game package on ESPN, especially in the early part of the 80s. Miami was on a lot. They started to go to Mississippi State, some of those other programs, and get their exposure and growth started. But yeah, that's really where it came back to. And the College World Series even was maybe tape delayed, picked up by some random station to be shown later. And then it became every game was televised by ESPN. And then it became every game is televised live by ESPN. And the growth of college baseball in the 80s, the attendance nationwide essentially doubled. The College World Series growth basically doubled. And then you look at where things are today, and you look at the city of Omaha and playing in a ballpark that, while it seems brand new, it's already, 14 years old already, or 13 years old. And
It's wild.
but it was built because of the College World Series success, and the city did not want to lose it. And television was a key factor in that. And then you back up again, and who started that? So, there's so many lines that you can trace to Ron Frazier about college baseball success, that's really the story as much as it is what he did at Miami.
So, David, just a few moments here before we hit the road. I want to give you an opportunity here at the end. The book is The Wizard of College Baseball: How Ron Fraser Elevated Miami and an Entire Sport to National Prominence. Elevator pitch. If folks are on the fence after this, and if they are, then what the hell's wrong with you? But if they're still on the fence about the book, give them 30 seconds as to why they should pick this up, make this their summer read at the beach or at the ballpark.
If you enjoy sports, especially baseball, especially college athletics, and you like the underdog story, you like entertaining stories, you like the inspirational side of things, influencing people's lives, all of it's rolled into one. That's what Ron Fraser did. Had such touch points across the world, literally, as I alluded to earlier with international baseball. Domestically, the growth can really be traced to him. But really, someone who was an innovator, someone who was just absolutely not going to take no for an answer, driven, and very, very successful and very well liked by everyone. And, he's just a really interesting character, a humorous side, an inspirational side, as I mentioned. I mean, all those pieces roll into one.
Yeah, I really do recommend this book, especially because of the voices, the quotes you get from folks about Coach. I think are really it's because you're covering such a long span of time. It's tempting to just summarize and kind of go over the early parts, but you really brought the story to life. I really do commend you for the work. Again, the authors David Brauer, the book The Wizard of College Baseball, Ron Fraser Elevated Miami, an entire sport to national prominence. David, thank you so much for your work. Thank you so much for your time, and good luck with the book.
Thank you so much, Matthew. Appreciate having you on or having me on, and appreciate everybody taking a look at this book at ronfraserbook.com. And I hope you enjoy the read.
We will share that link for sure.